Hello folks,
Hardly in Taiwan.
here. This is a beautiful although cold day. I decided to go out, have lunch. I just go for some health food, some McDonald's, and while I'm doing that, I'm gonna continue my story a little bit. You might remember I mentioned a Hungarian professor in Taiwan in my very first story about getting into Taiwan. So I think it's time to talk about him. This guy, Imre Zsoldos, or Zsoldos Imre in Hungarian, he was a monk and he was in Taiwan when I got to Taiwan for almost 40 years already. He had a very interesting life. He left Hungary during the Hungarian Revolution in 1956 against the communists, and he educated in France. Then he became a monk and he came to Taiwan. What's really special about him is that he spoke about 40 different languages, and what he was doing in Taiwan, he was giving about 5, 6 or maybe more masses a weekend, and he was doing them all in different languages. The first one may be Saturday morning Chinese mass, and then 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock one in English, and then one in Japanese, and then one in Spanish and in German. I don't even know what languages, but he spoke over 40 languages. I got to Taiwan in 1992. He was actually chosen to be the Man in the Year in America just before I got there. He was the one who made the first French-Chinese dictionary officially, so he got a big medal from Prime Minister of France, Chirac or Mitterrand or whichever it was at that time. He was writing a lot of poems and he got some very nice awards recognizing his poetry as well, so he was quite a guy. So anyway, when I got to Taiwan, he was a professor in a Christian university in Taiwan called Fu-Ren Fu-Ren University. It's a pretty good university actually. A little bit far from my home, but I visited him there a few weeks after I got to Taiwan.
Look at this beauty that is waiting for me here. Cool.
I told you, when I arrived at Taiwan, Professor Zsoldos was not there. I caught up with him a couple of weeks later. I called him and finally I could see him there. At that time he was about 60. He was a very fun guy. It was great being with him. He was a monk, but he was not that kind of monk that, you know, talking about God all the time. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. And he didn't have any problem with that. We talked about it, and then he never ever tried to persuade me into being a Christian or anything like that. He actually made religious jokes sometimes, and he could laugh about them. He was really a guy on his both feet. He was actually an interesting guy, you know. I met him the first time, and that was a couple of weeks after I arrived, and I had literally no money. It was still even before I got my first scholarship, so really I was out. So we meet up, and what is this guy doing? He invites me for a lunch, which is obviously great, but then he asked me if I need anything. Well, I didn't tell him I needed money, obviously, but I needed a pair of pants, and I didn't have the money for that. So he's like, okay, let's go and buy you some pants. But guess what? We are not going to some cheap place where you get a pant for something like $10 US. No. He is going to some brand place and he buys me a pair of pants that I actually didn't even really like because it was just too damn fancy and kind of uncomfortable for 5,000 NT dollars, which was about $200 at that time. Isn't it crazy? Of course, I just said thank you very much, but I was fuming inside because if he gives me the $200 or 5,000 NT dollars in cash, I could have bought myself a pair of pants and I could have actually lived on that for like a month. I met this guy pretty often, couldn't meet him every day because he was far away from me, but I met him often. He was always very nice to me. We had a lot of nice chats. He was very enthusiastic about computers. Now, what you need to know is these guys, these monks, they actually make a vow to be poor, so they only get like $100 US a month to spend, but on the other hand, they get everything pretty much, whatever they want, for free if they want. He actually built himself a state-of-the-art computer. Now, his computer skills were very interesting, you know. It took me hours on the phone to do the simplest ever thing. He was telling me things that he said was on the screen that I couldn't even dream about. But when a couple of years later, my wife visited him and saw the computer and told him, "Oh, Mr. Zsoldos, you are good at computers too." He just humbly said, "Yes." And that sums him up. He was like that. He was a fun guy. I loved him dearly. He got a stroke a few years ago, and although he didn't die right away, it took him away a couple of months later, and I still dearly miss him.